It was a bright Saturday morning when I decided to visit the local car dealership. I'd been saving for months, and today was the day I planned to make a big purchase. I'd spent weeks researching, test-driving cars, and narrowing down my options. The dealer, Smith Motors, had the exact model I wanted, and I was feeling confident that today would be the day I sealed the deal. I walked in, dressed in a tailored black suit, ready to make my first big investment. The salesperson behind the desk, a man in his early 40s with slicked back hair, looked up as I approached. He didn't smile or greet me, but instead seemed to take a moment to size me up. He didn't say anything right away, but I could tell something wasn't quite right. After a brief exchange, I was escorted to a shiny new sedan, the one I had my eye on for weeks. I could see the salesman's hesitation, though. He asked me for my ID and bank information, which I provided without hesitation, confident that I had the means to complete the purchase. But then his attitude shifted. He hesitated before walking off with my paperwork, murmuring something about checking on a few details. Something felt off, but I didn't think much of it. Maybe he was just having a bad day, I thought. I sat in the car, the leather seats cool under me, and tried to calm my nerves. The salesman returned a few minutes later, his expression more rigid, almost like he was avoiding eye contact. Then he told me he'd need to make a call to verify some things. That's when I began to feel the tension in the air. He walked back to the desk, where he pulled out his phone and dialed something. I couldn't hear his conversation, but I could see his body language. Something was wrong, and I had the sinking feeling that this was going to be a lot more than just a verification. A few minutes passed, and I could feel my excitement turning to confusion. Why was he making a call? The dealer hadn't even mentioned anything about additional steps for approval. I shifted in the car, adjusting the seat as I waited. A sense of unease began to settle in the pit of my stomach. Then, just as I was about to step out and ask what was going on, the dealership's manager walked over, a man in his late 50s, dressed in a sharp suit. He had the same stiff demeanor as the salesman, and the look on his face wasn't one of friendliness. It was almost as if he had just been given an order, something I couldn't quite place. "I'm sorry, sir," the manager said, his voice polite but with an edge. "We've had a policy change today. We're going to need to verify some details with the local authorities." His eyes avoided mine as he spoke, and I noticed his hand subtly hovering near his pocket, where his phone was tucked. I blinked, caught off guard. Authorities? What in the world could that be about? What are you talking about? I've given you all my information. You don't need to involve the police. I stood up from the car, my tone rising slightly. I could feel my patience running thin. The manager didn't respond right away. Instead, he turned to the salesman, who nodded and pulled out his phone again. A strange, almost nervous energy filled the space between us. Seconds later, I heard the unmistakable sound of sirens outside. I felt a chill wash over me as I glanced out the glass doors. A police car had just pulled up in front of the dealership. "Are you serious right now?" I muttered under my breath, disbelief washing over me. They had actually called the police on me, and the thought made my blood run cold. I wasn't sure if I was more shocked or angry. I stood there frozen for a moment, unable to wrap my mind around what was happening. Then, the door to the dealership swung open, and two officers walked in. Their eyes scanned the room before locking onto me. They didn't say anything right away, but I could see the questioning look in their eyes. The officers didn't make any sudden movements, but their presence made everything feel more tense. The dealership had fallen completely silent. Customers who were browsing cars or talking to other salespeople froze, their gazes flickering nervously between me and the officers. The manager stepped forward, motioning to me as if I were some sort of threat. "We just need to verify the situation," he said quickly, his voice a little too high-pitched. "This gentleman here is attempting to purchase a vehicle, but we've run into a few issues with his credentials." His eyes darted to the officers, signaling them to come closer. I shook my head, feeling a growing sense of injustice creeping in. "There's nothing wrong with my credentials," I said firmly. "You've already checked everything. I've given you everything you asked for." One of the officers, a tall man with a stern face, nodded and looked at me closely. "We're just going to need to ask a few questions, sir. Nothing personal, just procedure." His voice was calm, but there was an underlying tone of authority I couldn't ignore. I could feel the heat rising in my chest. They didn't even know me, and here they were, treating me like I was guilty of something. I wanted to shout, to ask them how they could treat me this way, but I held back, trying to keep my composure. The second officer, a younger woman, stood by the door, her eyes never leaving me. She seemed to be waiting for something, perhaps to gauge my reaction. I glanced around the showroom and saw the salesman standing near the desk, looking uncomfortable, yet oddly satisfied by the situation unfolding. I turned back to the officers, who were now in close conversation with the manager, probably explaining what they thought was wrong with my attempt to purchase a car. But I knew the truth. It was something else. They weren't questioning my credentials, they were questioning me for a reason that was far less obvious. The silence was broken by the sound of my phone vibrating in my pocket. It was a call I had been waiting for all morning, my bank, confirming the transaction. But I wasn't sure if I should answer it in front of them, not with everything that was happening. I decided to take the call. I pulled my phone out and answered it, trying to keep my voice steady. "Hello. Mr. Hayes," the voice on the other end asked, a friendly tone cutting through the tension. "This is Rachel from Central Bank. I'm just confirming your car purchase." Before I could respond, one of the officers stepped closer, his presence looming over me. "You need to hang up that phone," he said, his tone a little more forceful than before. I held up my hand, signaling for him to give me a moment. "This is my bank. I'm handling something important here," I explained, trying to remain calm. The officer didn't back off. "We'll need to wrap this up," he insisted, his eyes narrowed. "You're not allowed to make calls during an investigation." I felt a flash of anger surge through me. "Investigation?" I repeated, the word bitter on my tongue. "There's no investigation. I'm just trying to buy a car. There's no reason for you to be here." Rachel's voice on the phone seemed to soften. "Sir, I'm sorry for any confusion, but we've already processed your request. There's no reason to be concerned about your transaction." I looked up at the officer, who was now visibly annoyed. His partner, the woman, glanced at him before speaking. "Sir, we're going to need you to step outside with us. There's been a complaint." "Complaint?" I shook my head, my heart pounding. "A complaint about what? I haven't done anything wrong." The manager, who had been standing to the side, stepped forward again. "We just need you to cooperate," he said, his voice tinged with unease. "The officers are just doing their job." I stared at him in disbelief. Cooperate? This wasn't a simple misunderstanding. This was a deliberate move, a decision made to push me into a corner, to make me the problem in a situation where I was simply trying to make a purchase. But something inside me snapped. I wasn't going to be pushed around like this. "Let's be clear," I said, my voice firm. "There is no reason for any of this. If you don't want to sell me the car, then just say it. But don't pull the police into this." The officers exchanged glances, their eyes narrowing as the tension in the air grew thick. The younger officer spoke up, her voice calmer now. "We're not here to escalate anything. Just remain calm, and everything will be fine." But I knew better. Something wasn't right. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. The whole situation felt surreal, like a bad dream that I couldn't wake up from. Here I was, standing in the middle of a car dealership, surrounded by police officers, over something as simple as purchasing a car. I had worked hard to get to this point, and yet, everything was being called into question for reasons I couldn't understand. The older officer, who had been silent for a while, stepped forward. "We're just doing our job, sir," he said, his tone less hostile now but still authoritative. "We'll sort this out quickly, but we need to ask you some questions outside." He motioned toward the door with his hand, indicating that I was expected to comply. I was starting to lose my patience. "I've already told you, I've done nothing wrong. I'm not going anywhere with you." The silence in the showroom became suffocating. The other customers, still lingering in the background, were now casting uncertain glances between me and the officers. I could hear the low murmur of whispered conversations, but nobody spoke up. It was like everyone was just waiting for me to cave in. The manager, sensing that things were about to spiral out of control, stepped in again. "Let's just take this outside, all right," he said, his voice surprisingly calm, though there was an edge to it. "We can resolve this without making a scene." I took one last look at the salesman, who was standing behind the desk, avoiding my gaze like he was somehow guilty. He hadn't said a word since the officers had arrived, but his presence felt like part of the problem. Was he in on this? I wondered. I clenched my fists, trying to keep my emotions in check. "I'm not going anywhere. This is harassment, and I'm not leaving without some answers," I said, my voice firm but controlled. "You need to explain to me what the issue is. Now." The tension in the air was palpable. The officers exchanged another look, but they didn't respond right away. Instead, they just stood there, silent and watchful. Finally, the younger officer spoke up again, her voice softer. "Look, sir, we don't want this to escalate. If you can just step outside with us, we'll clear everything up." But the words felt hollow now, a polite suggestion that carried the weight of an unspoken ultimatum. At that moment, I had a choice to make. I could continue to resist, drawing attention to how wrong this situation was, or I could comply and let them drag me into whatever trap they were setting up. But either way, I wasn't going to let them win. I straightened up, preparing myself for what was to come. I stood my ground, staring at the officers and then back at the manager. "I'm not stepping outside without a real explanation. You've called the police on me for no reason, and now I want answers." The older officer let out a long, frustrated sigh, his gaze never leaving mine. He stepped forward, but this time his body language was less confrontational. "We're not accusing you of anything. We just need to make sure everything's legitimate. You understand that, right?" I could feel the pressure building up. I wasn't about to let them make this seem like I was the one being unreasonable. "No, I don't understand," I replied, my voice low but steady. "What's going on here? Why are you treating me like this? All I want to do is buy a car." The younger officer stepped in, trying to ease the tension. "Sir, we're just doing our job, like I said. We don't want this to get out of hand." She glanced toward the manager, who gave a barely perceptible nod. That was when it clicked. I had been giving them the benefit of the doubt, but now I was starting to see the bigger picture. This wasn't just a mistake. They were stalling, avoiding confrontation, but ultimately pushing me toward a point where I'd be forced into submission. "Is this really about me buying a car?" I asked, my voice cold. "Or is there something else going on here?" The manager shifted uncomfortably, his gaze darting toward the officers before finally looking me in the eye. "We're just doing what's necessary," he said, his words carefully measured, as if rehearsed. "We have procedures we need to follow." "Procedures?" I repeated. "So you call the cops on a guy who's been nothing but polite, just trying to make a purchase? Is this your standard procedure?" The silence that followed was thick with tension. The manager didn't respond. Instead, he looked away, as if trying to avoid facing the reality of what had just happened. That's when the door to the dealership opened again, and another officer walked in, one I hadn't seen before. His uniform was neat, and he looked around with a calm, assessing demeanor. But when he saw me standing there, still in the middle of this absurd situation, his expression changed. He took a step toward me and held up his hand. "Gentlemen, we need to talk." The two officers who had been speaking with me froze. They clearly didn't expect him. The newcomer turned to the manager, his tone flat. "I just got off the phone with the precinct. You called this in as a suspicious purchase, but I'm being told there's no cause for any concern here. You're holding this man up for no reason." The manager's face flushed, and I could see the tension in his shoulders. The other two officers exchanged uneasy looks, and I felt a knot in my stomach begin to loosen. The new officer's eyes locked onto mine. "Sir, you're free to go. I suggest you get in touch with your lawyer about this. We'll be doing a full review of how this was handled." I couldn't believe it. The moment I had been waiting for had arrived, but it didn't feel like a victory. More like an inevitable conclusion to something I should never have had to go through. As I walked toward the door, I shot one last look at the salesman and manager, who were now standing in stunned silence. They hadn't expected this. They had tried to make me the problem, but it was clear now that the tables had turned. I stepped out of the dealership and into the bright daylight, the sound of the police car's engine humming in the background. I could feel the tension in my body start to ease, but the anger still simmered beneath the surface. I wasn't sure what had just happened or why it had to go so far, but I knew one thing for certain: I wasn't going to let it slide. The officer who had come in at the last minute walked with me, his footsteps steady and reassuring. "Sorry about all of this," he said, his voice calm. "It shouldn't have escalated to this point, but we'll make sure it's handled." I nodded, though I didn't say anything. I was too caught up in my own thoughts to offer any response. How could something so simple, buying a car, turn into something so ugly? I had done everything by the book. I had the funds, the paperwork, and the intent to make a legitimate purchase. And yet, here I was, facing a group of officers like I was some sort of criminal. As the officer continued to walk beside me, he gave me a sympathetic look. "You'll want to file a formal complaint," he said. "I don't know what their issue was, but this isn't how we handle things." I wasn't sure if I wanted to bother. Part of me just wanted to forget the whole thing and move on. But another part, the part that was still seething with injustice, knew that I couldn't let this go without some kind of accountability. "I'll think about it," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "But they need to know this isn't okay." The officer gave me a nod of agreement, his tone softening. "You're right. No one should be treated like that. We'll get to the bottom of it." As I reached my car, parked on the far side of the dealership lot, I realized that the frustration was still there. I didn't feel vindicated. I didn't feel like a winner. I felt exhausted. The officer lingered for a moment, then turned back toward the dealership. "You're free to go now," he said. "We'll take it from here." I watched him walk away, his form growing smaller as he re-entered the dealership. But I didn't drive off immediately. Instead, I just sat there in the car for a while, my fingers tight on the steering wheel, staring at the dealership from a distance. I knew this wouldn't be the last time I'd deal with something like this. The fact that it had happened today, over something so ordinary, made me realize how far we still had to go. I was just one person, and while I'd won this round, there were others out there facing the same things every day. As I drove away, the weight of the experience lingered, a reminder that nothing in life was ever as simple as it seemed, and that sometimes, you had to fight just to be treated fairly. The drive home was a blur. The usual peace and rhythm of my car's hum on the open road felt distant, almost foreign. My mind replayed the events from the dealership over and over again, each moment like a punch to my gut. How had I allowed myself to get pulled into that? A simple transaction turned into an ordeal, and the worst part was realizing it wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. The dealership had assumed something about me the moment I walked through the door. They didn't see me as a customer, just as someone who didn't belong there. And I wasn't going to let that slide. I couldn't. When I got home, I sat down at the kitchen table, my head still spinning. I knew I had to do something about what happened, but the more I thought about it, the more I felt like I had to turn the situation into something bigger than just a personal grievance. I wasn't the only one who'd been subjected to this kind of treatment, and if I let it go without speaking up, I would be part of the problem. I reached for my phone and pulled up the dealership's contact information. As I started drafting an email, my hands paused above the keyboard. This wasn't just about me or my experience, it was about accountability, about ensuring that others wouldn't go through the same thing. I needed to make sure this wasn't swept under the rug. It couldn't be. I spent the next hour writing. I described everything that had happened in the dealership, from the moment I walked into the way the police had been called without cause. I listed my frustrations, but I also outlined my intent. I wasn't angry, I was determined. I demanded that they take full responsibility for their actions, and that steps be taken to ensure no one else would face this kind of treatment. When I finished, I reread the email one last time before hitting send. It was a small step, but it felt like the right one. Maybe it wouldn't change everything. Maybe it wouldn't even change the dealership. But it was a step toward making sure that something like this didn't happen again, at least not without consequences. The rest of the night passed quietly. I didn't expect to hear back immediately, but the weight I had been carrying all day seemed a little lighter. The fight wasn't over. I knew that. But I had stood up for myself when it mattered, and that, for now, would have to be enough. And as I lay in bed, I closed my eyes knowing one thing: sometimes, just speaking the truth was enough to begin to change things.